There is a scene in the Gospels that almost no one preaches on honestly. It is 40 days long, it takes place in a desert, and in it, Jesus holds a sustained conversation with the figure the New Testament calls the devil. Not a vision. Not a metaphor the text signals as symbolic. A dialogue, with questions, counter-questions, scripture citations from both sides, and 3 distinct proposals that are each refused. Most sermons treat this scene as a story about resisting temptation. That reading is not wrong, but it is thin, because what Jung spent 40 years of his career mapping is exactly why Jesus had to have this conversation, and why having it rather than avoiding it was the most decisive act in the Gospel. The first time I read the temptation account in Matthew 4 as something other than a morality lesson, it unsettled me in a way I had not expected. The standard version, Jesus is hungry, the devil tries to trick him. Jesus quotes scripture, the devil leaves, feels tidy in a way the text itself is not. Read it slowly and something else emerges. The conversation has a logic. It builds. And the figure Jesus is speaking with knows the scriptures as well as he does. He quotes Psalm 91 in the second exchange with a precision that is not the behavior of a figure trying to deceive through ignorance. He is citing the text correctly. The argument is not that the scriptures are wrong. The argument is that they can be used to justify a shortcut. Jung's framework is the right tool to open this, but we need to understand it precisely before we apply it. Carl Jung spent decades developing what he called the psychology of individuation, the process by which a human being becomes fully themselves. Not an optimistic self-help process, but a confrontation. His central claim was that the psyche is not unified. It contains layers. The ego, which is the conscious self we identify as I. The persona, the social mask we present to the world. And below both of these, the shadow. The shadow is the part of the personality that the ego refuses to acknowledge. It is not simply the evil within us. That is a common misreading, and an important one to correct. The shadow contains everything the conscious self has deemed unacceptable, whether through cultural conditioning, personal history, or the demands of the persona. For a deeply religious person, the shadow might contain doubt. For someone who prizes gentleness, it might contain rage. For a person who defines himself by service, it might contain the desire for power or recognition. The shadow is not the opposite of the self. It is the self, specifically the parts the ego has decided cannot be admitted into the light of conscious identity. The critical point in Jung's framework, and this is where it connects directly to the temptation account, is what happens when the shadow is never confronted. Jung was unambiguous about this. A shadow that remains unconscious does not disappear. It accumulates energy, gains autonomy, and eventually acts on its own. The person who never examines his desire for power will find it expressing itself in distorted ways, in subtle dominance, in resentment of others who have what he will not claim, in the manipulation he tells himself he is not performing. Jung described this dynamic in his clinical work repeatedly. The shadow denied becomes the shadow that drives from below, out of sight, without the ego's knowledge or consent. Individuation required what he called the confrontation with the shadow. The person had to turn, face what was in the dark, and engage it. Not to become it, not to be consumed by it, but to bring it into conscious relationship, to become whole. A self that has never faced its shadow is not a whole self. It is a defended one. And a defended self, in Jung's framework, is not a free one. He described the shadow's typical presentation in one phrase worth holding. It does not usually offer what is obviously wrong. It offers what is genuinely desired, through a path that costs less than the real one. Now return to Matthew 4:1-11 with that in mind. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. The word translated as tempted, in Greek, is parasai, to test, to probe, to try the quality of something the way a metalsmith tests metal in fire. This is not incidental. The temptation is not an ambush that catches Jesus off guard. It is a test that the Spirit initiates. Jesus is led there deliberately, Immediately after his baptism, immediately after the voice from heaven has identified him as the beloved Son. The wilderness is not an accident of geography. It is the necessary next step. The context is also worth noting. 40 days. The same number Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness after the Exodus, the same number Moses spent on Sinai before receiving the law. The wilderness in the Hebrew imagination is the place where the relationship between God and his people is tested without the insulation of society, provision, or routine. It is the place where what a person actually trusts is revealed, because everything else has been stripped away. Jesus enters this space alone, hungry, with full access to whatever power belongs to the Son of God. And the conversation begins. One thing the text establishes that is easy to skip over. The devil does not open with an obvious lie. He opens with a conditional. If you are the Son of God, that echoes precisely the language the voice from heaven used at the baptism 3 verses earlier. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Matthew 3:17. The wilderness dialogue begins by picking up the thread of the identity, just publicly confirmed, and asking what that identity is actually for. The 40 days are, in this sense, the moment between the declaration of identity and the first public act, the moment where the meaning of the identity is established before it becomes visible in action. The 3 proposals the devil makes are not random. Read them as a sequence, and the architecture becomes clear. The first, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread. The proposal is to use divine power for personal survival, to convert a public identity into a private resource. Jesus has been fasting for 40 days. The need is real. The power is genuinely available. The refusal is not that the need is illegitimate. The refusal is to Deuteronomy 8:3. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Notice what the refusal costs. Jesus stays hungry. He does not solve the physical problem. He names a deeper resource and remains in the condition that makes it necessary to trust it. The second, Satan takes him to the pinnacle of the temple and cites Psalm 91. God will command his angels to guard you, to catch you so that you do not strike your foot against a stone. The proposal is to use divine protection as public proof of divine identity, to make God perform on cue, to collapse the relationship between Father and Son into a spectacle of verification. If you are who you say you are, prove it by testing the promise. Jesus refuses with Deuteronomy 6:16. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. The Greek word here is ekperazais, the same root as tempted in verse 1, now redirected. The very activity Jesus was led into the wilderness to undergo, he refuses to impose on the Father. The temptation was to convert trust into transaction, to demand evidence of love rather than live inside it. The third is the one most sermons rush past, and it is the most revealing of the 3. Satan shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, and offers them in exchange for one act of worship. This is commonly read as a straightforward bribe, power in exchange for allegiance. But look more carefully at what is being offered. The kingdoms of the world, the restoration of creation to a human ruler. Psalm 2:8 describes this as the messianic inheritance. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. Satan is offering, in distorted form, exactly what the Father has already promised. The proposal is not to make Jesus into something he is not. The proposal is to give him what he came for, through a path that bypasses the cross entirely. And here is what Jung's framework reveals about the shape of this sequence that a purely moral reading misses entirely. The 3 proposals move in a specific direction, from body, bread, physical survival, to relationship, prove the Father will catch you, to mission, take the kingdoms now, without cost. They are not 3 separate attacks. They are one argument in 3 movements, each one going deeper into what is actually at stake. The first tests whether Jesus will use his identity for comfort. The second tests whether he needs the relationship with the Father to perform for him. The third tests whether he will accept the goal through a means that redefines who he serves to get there. In Jung's terms, this is the shadow confrontation structured with precision. What each proposal names is a possible distortion of something entirely real: the legitimate need for sustenance, the genuine intimacy between father and son, the actual inheritance that belongs to the Messiah. The shadow is not presenting fantasy. It is presenting true goods through configurations that corrupt them. And this is exactly how Jung described the shadow's method. It does not tempt with what is obviously worthless. It tempts with what you actually want, offered through a door that looks like a shortcut but changes the nature of what you become by walking through it. The crucial detail that most readings miss is that Jesus does not cut the conversation short. He does not rebuke the devil after the first proposal and walk away. He stays. He answers each proposal with a counter drawn from the same scriptural tradition the devil is using. He lets the sequence run to its completion. 40 days of sustained engagement with the full weight of what the mission could become if its logic were twisted at each joint. This is not avoidance. This is the opposite of avoidance. It is the most complete confrontation the text records. Jung wrote in several of his later works, particularly in Answer to Job, that the divine relationship with the dark is not one of simple rejection, but of engagement. He was reaching in that strange and unorthodox book towards something the temptation account shows with more clarity than he could construct philosophically. That wholeness is not achieved by refusing to look at what the shadow contains, but by facing it fully and not becoming it. This is where the gospel goes beyond what Jung's framework can offer, and the distance is significant. Jung's individuation is a human process. The shadow confrontation he mapped is available to anyone willing to undertake it, through analysis, through sustained honesty, through the long work of self-examination. But it is a project the self undertakes about the self. When a person integrates their shadow in the Jungian sense, they become more whole. The integration does not extend outward. It does not repair what the shadow has already damaged in others, in structures, in the wider fabric of a world shaped by shadows that were never faced. What happens in Matthew 4 is not a self-development project. It is a confrontation with a consequence that extends far beyond the individual undergoing it. Jesus enters the wilderness not as a person seeking wholeness for himself, but as the representative of humanity, the one who, as Paul writes in Romans 5:19, will undo through his obedience what Adam's disobedience initiated. The wilderness is the reversal of Eden, where the first human faced the question of God's trustworthiness and found the serpent's argument more persuasive. The second faces the same question under conditions that are considerably harder, alone, hungry, with direct access to power, and holds, not once, 3 times. The Eden parallel is not incidental. In Genesis 3, the proposal the serpent brings to Eve is structured identically to the proposals in Matthew 4. It names a real good, wisdom, becoming like God who knows good and evil, offered through a path that circumvents the relationship with God entirely. The fruit is genuinely desirable. The text says so explicitly. The knowledge it promises is not entirely false. The problem is not the thing desired, but the means. And behind the means, the redefinition of the relationship with God that the means requires. Adam and Eve take the shortcut. The consequence is not simply punishment, but exile from the relationship that gave the garden its meaning. Jesus enters a different wilderness. Literally, not the garden but the desert, the stripped-down version, where there is no fruit and no abundance and no question about whether the conditions are favorable, and refuses the same structure of proposal 3 times in 3 different registers. The reversal is not accidental. Matthew is writing for a Jewish audience who would recognize the shape of the scene immediately. What Israel failed to do in 40 years, trust God through the wilderness. Jesus does in 40 days. What Adam failed to do in the garden, hold the relationship when the shortcut was offered, Jesus holds in the desert when the conditions are far worse. This is not incidental framing. It is the claim of the gospel about who Jesus is and what he came to repair. And then he comes out and begins to announce the kingdom. Jung wrote extensively about what happens when an institution, not just an individual, fails to confront its shadow. In his view, the shadow dynamic operates at collective scale as well as personal scale. A religious institution that never examines its desire for power will find that desire expressing itself in the authority structures it builds. A movement that never faces its capacity for violence will find it surfacing in what it does to dissenters. He made these observations about the Christian church specifically, in a way that was uncomfortable and not entirely wrong. But the diagnosis misses the source material. What Jesus does in the wilderness is the precise opposite of shadow avoidance at institutional scale. He exposes, names, and refuses the distortions of his own mission before the mission has begun. The corruption Jung diagnosed in the institution is not present in the founder's confrontation. It enters later when those who carry the mission stop doing what the founder did in the desert. The significance of the wilderness sequence for everything that follows is that Jesus does not arrive at his public ministry as someone who has never examined the distortions his mission could take. He arrives having faced each one explicitly, in the language the scriptures themselves use, and refused it. When he heals, it is not to demonstrate power for his own credibility. When he accepts the worship of those he restores, it is not purchased by allegiance to any other lord. When he dies on the cross rather than calling down 12 legions of angels, which, as he tells Peter in Matthew 26:53, he could have done, it is not because he lacks options. It is because the third proposal was already answered in the desert. He knows what the shortcut costs. He refused it before anyone could see. The cross is the shadow confrontation completed in public, where the wilderness was private. 40 days in a location no one witnessed. Calvary is the same refusal performed before the city, the soldiers, the religious authorities, and the crowd. The full weight of what the devil offered is refused again. The kingdoms without cost, the avoidance of suffering, the exit from the path the Father set. Jesus does not quote Deuteronomy from the cross. He quotes Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He enters the place where no text resolves the moment, where the Father does not intervene, where the outcome cannot be negotiated. And through it, as 1 Corinthians 15:55 puts it, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" Jung could describe the necessity of the shadow confrontation. He could map the contents of the shadow with clinical precision. He could show, across decades of practice, that the person who refuses that confrontation becomes increasingly driven by what they will not face. What he could not offer is what happens after the confrontation, not in the sense the gospel offers it. The integrated shadow in Jungian psychology produces a more whole individual. The confrontation Jesus undergoes in Matthew 4 and completes at Calvary produces something that extends beyond the individual who underwent it, available to everyone who has ever been lost in the territory the shadow represents. The real question this leaves you with is not about the devil, it is about the three proposals. Each of the temptations in the desert is aimed at a real need. The need to be sustained when resources run out, the need to know the relationship with God is secure without requiring proof, the need to see the mission actually accomplish what it was meant to accomplish. Which of those three needs are you currently trying to meet through a path that costs less than the one being pointed to? The desert does not end because the 40 days are over. The argument follows you into whatever wilderness comes next, and it always comes with Scripture in hand.